Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay, and in this new tyFLOW tutorial we're going to focus on creating realistic sand effects, taking advantage of the Granular sand solver inside of this tyFLOW tutorial. And I want to dig into how to simulate sand, dirt, and creating chunks of granular sand that actually break apart realistically based on our simulated impacts inside of tyFLOW. I'm really excited for this lesson. It's going to be a lot of fun. Let's dive in. First of all, I want to welcome you to this new video. If you're not familiar with me and my YouTube channel, I am a visual effects supervisor. I've been working in the VFX industry for almost 25 years. I've worked for Industrial Light and Magic, Blur Studio, Ubisoft, Autodesk, Activision, and plenty of other big studios on films like Transformers, Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Superman, Halo, Bioshock, and plenty of others. Finally, I also have a new free visual effects class if you want to check it out right now. It's over 18 hours of free visual effects training focused on taking a real feature film visual effects shot through from beginning to end, working in a real production pipeline. We cover everything from creating pyrotechnics, destruction, and going through photoreal lighting, rendering, and compositing inside of a visual effects workflow. And the class spans over 8 core videos. You can download the entire class for free right now, including all of the HD footage, which was shot on a Red Dragon 6K camera in downtown Los Angeles, and the HDRIs, 3D scene assets, models, and everything else you need to do the class. You can get the class right now. It's free. Go to vfxcourse.com and you can get started right now. I'm only offering this class for a little bit longer, so if this is something that you want to do, this is your chance to take advantage of this opportunity right now and get the free live action visual effects class. Again, it's at vfxcourse.com. Now, for those of you not aware, tyFLOW is a new particle plugin for Macs. It's available to download right now for free during the beta development cycle. You can download the plugin at beta.tyflow.com and simply drop the DLO file into your plugins directory for 3ds Max and you'll be good to go. So if you enjoy this video, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to my channel, as I'll try to post videos twice per week, and I've got a lot more visual effects training for Max and Houdini coming up. Finally, right now, I'm just testing the waters with tyFLOW. If you want to see more videos and tutorials and free classes on this subject, please take a moment to leave a comment and let me know. I've only got finite time alongside the podcast and everything else I'm doing, and I want to make sure I'm putting my time where it counts. So if this is something that you would like to see more videos on, let me know by leaving a comment. And if it sounds like you do want to see more of these, I'll try to put my attention on building more tutorials for this and for you over the coming weeks. So stay tuned. Okay, so I'm going to dive right into this. A couple of things I want to mention is go to customize unit setup. I just want to mention I'm always working with generic units, but this is all purely for display. But system unit setup, I'm working with centimeters. So just keep that in mind. Also, just for 1 second, I just want to mention the height of this guy is roughly this, so 40 by 75. So just keeping that in mind in terms of the scale that I'm working at. Now, what I've got here is a polygon mesh of this century, and I have cap holes on there. I want to talk about this in a moment just because it's really important. Before we do that though, let's just create our tyFLOW. So I'm just going to go into create primitives, tyFLOW, drag this out in the viewport, and go open editor. So one thing I'm doing is I've just got this disabled and I've split my windows so that way I can fit this here. And now what I want to do is I'm going to do a birth voxel, and this will allow me to evenly distribute particles throughout the closed mesh. Notice I said closed. So what it does is it creates a level set and distributes the particles through all the cells. So when I click this, we can see particles are all being distributed all the way through. And I can control the resolution. So here we can see that we've evenly distributed these particles through. One thing that I want to point out, okay, this is really important, is that right now I have a cap holes on there. And the reason is that This is a model I bought for $1 off of TurboSquid. So the mesh wasn't perfect. If I do an STL check, so if I ever want to see if my mesh is completely closed, if it's clean, best thing to do is apply an STL check and then go click check. And it's going to tell me there's 95 errors. So in other words, there's leaks throughout my model. So what I had done is I added a cap on here, and it's still kind of screwing up the surface topology. It's not perfect, but it'll do. If I do an STL check, there's still couple of errors. Okay, so just keep that in mind that ultimately you want to be working with clean topology. Otherwise, your dynamics aren't going to work necessarily. Same thing with doing things like a level set. It won't necessarily distribute the particles properly because there's a leak. The surface isn't entirely closed. So really important. I do get a bit of feedback on YouTube that I talk too much, but trust me, I've been doing this long enough. I've got a mentorship with over 1,000 students. I know what works and what doesn't. So I could easily tell you the step-by-step recipe for all this stuff, and I guarantee you're going to miss out on a lot of stuff and it's not going to click. So there is method behind the madness. Okay, so this being said, I want to go through my level set and I want to now build out a very basic granular system, and from there we'll begin to add to it and make it a lot more complicated. But I want to talk about the basics and the fundamentals behind it first. One thing I want to quickly mention is that this isn't a true granular solver in the sense that if you look at RealFlow, if you look at Houdini, there's it's very different dynamics involved. That being said, like, this is really cool. It works really well. It's really fast. So there's nothing wrong with it, but it is slightly different to what you would see in a few of the other packages. So I just want to bring that up ahead of time just for clarification's sake. Now, one thing I want to do is I'm going to drop in a particle physics. I'm going to do a force, and I'm going to do a collision. So I'm just hitting tab to add these in. Always put your collisions at the bottom because we want them to be sampled last. So that way they'll catch anything that's going on throughout this. So now that I've got that, I've got my collision. I'm just going to pick and add my surface and just make sure that the object is below these particles, otherwise they'll fall through. The other thing I'll do is with my force, I'm just going to make this -0.1 for gravity, and that just means the whole thing's going to fall down. So without, and I'm just going to left click on the right side here, so you can see that turns it off. So without the physics applied, this is just a regular dumb particle system. So the whole thing just falls down the ground. It's the particle physics that will allow this to have a basic solver that will allow these particles to interact. So that's really important, and already we get like a nice result. Nothing special, but just something to work with. So let's just go through a couple of things to start with. With the birth voxels, we can choose to consistently emit particles the entire time. There's only going to be special cases that you want that on, but it's great that it is there. You can emit volume or surface. Again, just depends on what you're trying to tackle. The main thing is choosing the size of the cells. So we can see voxel size. And this means that the smaller the size, the more that can fit in, because it's trying to distribute the particles throughout the entire volume. So a bigger size means less cells, whereas we can go ultra fine. Of course, keep in mind with dynamics, that's going to eventually get pretty slow. So for now, let's just start with something kind of relatively simple that we can build on. Now, other things are progressive offsets. So this is just interesting if you want to screw around with just having some kind of shift in terms of the way that it distributes the shape. Again, there's certain situations where this could be useful. I'd rather have more options than less in general, but I think in general, most of this stuff we're not going to really mess with too much unless you're just trying to get a very abstract kind of look to it. The main thing is cull duplicate voxels. This is important, just especially with dynamics, just to ensure that it's not creating any duplicate particles on top of each other. Otherwise, it could cause it to explode. Jitter is regular with any level sets or anything like that, fluids that are being distributed. All it does is just a, I guess, an equation that would randomize the positions around it. So it can be helpful if you're getting jagged edges, stuff like that, just to help randomize this and make it a little bit more natural. But keep in mind that we're trying not to have any particles overlap. So I'd prefer right now to have these kind of evenly distributed, because it's ensuring that none of them are going to sit with each other too much. So just keep that in mind. Other than that, the other thing, this is going to be important for the way that we're going to be doing everything, is you can control the initial scale, how that's applied. So this isn't going to look like it's doing anything, but if I were to go down here, ignoring the scale is actually going to give us a different result. Now the reason for that is that our particle physics by default are on scale radius. If they're on shape, wouldn't do anything, but they're on scale, and we want to keep it on that because I want to universally rely on scale to read all these settings. Otherwise, what happens, and I've seen other people do this, that they will change the resolution here, then they got to go and update it everywhere else. The thing is, just keep it on scale, keep this as from all, or whatever you want to set up here, but this will universally distribute scale, which then this reads, and we'll set everything up to read scale, and it'll stay consistent. So you can set this to be like based on the z-axis, because max is z up, and that would, you know, based on the fact that this is a long object, you can choose like how you want to sample this stuff or ignore it. I'm going to keep it on from all, and again, you got a multiplier, so that would explode it, or you can compress it, but keep it at 1. Like I said, all of this is fine. So like I said, only thing in here to really worry about is the voxel size, cull duplicates, and if you want to jitter this a little bit, you're more than welcome to. The main thing is keep this on from all, set that to 1. Now going to particle physics, right now we won't really mess with this too much. We've got a lot of stuff. I don't want to go through like every setting right now. I want to keep this pretty on point, but the main thing is we just want to have the default particle collisions. We don't need to worry about attractions. Scale 1, and we don't have to worry about the tolerance. Tolerance is more to do with the radius overall, just in terms of searching for other particles near it. So lowering it will keep everything a lot tighter, but you know, you can use this just to control the relationship between the particles. So main thing is stiffness and friction. This is going to control like how much this is all kept together. So we can see that right now they just tend to overlap on top of each other, whereas it maxes out at 1, and that's just going to cause it to respect its collision area a lot more. You can say draw collision shapes, and that's going to show you the collision radius, and that might make a bit more sense for some of these values if you ever wanted to mess around with them to get a better understanding. You can set the friction to 1. I'm going to turn that off because it's a little bit slow. In general, like I said, I want to kind of quickly mention this stuff, but we don't really need to worry about any of this right now. The main thing is just making sure this is on a scale of 1, and stiffness we'll keep at 1, friction we can bring up a little bit, but that is all that we're going to really mess with right now. So finally, we won't worry about any noise or anything in here. I mainly just wanted to add a little bit of gravity, and it's the only thing we're going to use it for. Collision, we'll get into this stuff later on, but I do want to kind of just explain this a little bit, so that way it's not a mystery like what's going on. The main thing is that I've just, you know, I'm getting tongue-tied, it's late at night here. I've covered at least like all the critical settings that we need. Now, the big thing, and this is how it all works, is going to be the particle bind. And I've covered this before as well for different things, but particle bind will create a relationship between all the other particles. So already you can see that this is kind of acting a little bit differently because we have this enabled. So particle bind will just kind of give us a relationship between each and every one. And what we can do is make this be a bit stronger, so that way they, you know, aren't falling as much. We increase the values here. Whatever we want to do, there's a lot of different stuff that we can do. What I think is important is we keep this on scale. We'll set the diameter a little bit higher. The bindings we'll keep like around 75. The main thing is, just so we can see what the heck is going on, let's enable displaying it here so we can see the relationship. So I think this is really important because it'll help you understand how these bindings work. Now, the max binds basically is communicating how many relationships each particle can have. So in other words, it looks kind of very linear at the moment because it's one directional. So what happens is we have the range where each particle is individually reading a distance based on, again, scale, because we're keeping it consistent. So scale, and then this is how it's prioritizing the order. Okay, so with this, we can set this really low, and then there's no relationship because no particles are really near each other on creation. And if you ever wanted to, I haven't messed with this, but you could set this continuous. And yeah, okay, so I've never done that before, but that's a way if you ever wanted particles to actually relate with each other, then you can get them to actually stick together or whatever you want to do, or based on different conditions. Main thing is though, as we increase the radius, it's got a bigger search radius, so it's looking around for more particles. And the thing is, right now, it looks for the closest one and it creates a relationship with just that one particle. And so the relationship isn't going to be very tight because of that. You know, in fact, you can see here, it just means that every single particle has one friend, and that's it. So what if we gave them two friends? Now when this collapses down, it's a little bit slower, but you can see now all of these particles are exponentially attaching to more particles. So we can lower the variation as well, whatever we want to do. So hopefully that makes sense. So you can actually create a really tight bond between everything by having more particles, and that means more relationships. And that way suddenly now this is reinforced because, you know, strength in numbers, all of these are able to keep together enough that they actually reinforce what's collapsing down and it stays together. Okay, so in general, keep that in mind. I think this defaults to 100. I'm going to keep it around 75, which again, the more relationships, the more it's trying to average itself out, and the solver will get slower because of that. Okay, so I'm going to turn show bindings off, and let's start to pick up the pace a little bit. I just wanted to go over a little bit of that because I feel like a lot of people don't have the correct understanding about how this stuff works, and it's pretty straightforward, but you got to understand you know, the simplicity in the idea, but how effective it can be when you really understand it. So I'm going to go to my display. I'm going to change this to sprites. And one final thing I'll mention is sprites rock. I really like this just because it automatically updates based on the scale. It's reading the scale. So in other words, if I go back to my voxels and I give this more resolution, the radius goes down because of that. So it's just a neat way to kind of keep this fairly accurate. And unless we're changing any of this stuff, the display is going to read accurately based on that. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so I'm just going to change that back to 2. So right now I've got this on sprites. We have this all collapsing down. And as we saw before, it's all kind of dangling. What we can do next is, in fact, just for the time being, I'm going to duplicate this guy and rotate it a little bit. And the reason is I just want to use this just as one that we can kind of have drop from the sky, fall on the ground, and we can kind of mess with it a little bit more. So I think that just might work a little bit better for what we're trying to do. One last thing, it kind of looks like the particles are penetrating. Okay, no, they're fine. Okay, so we have that collapsing down, and it's keeping its relationship based on what we got. Now, what I want to do is, what if we wanted this to actually break? We can go to particle binding and we can say break based on these different conditions. And right now it's based on stretching to 5. So that means 5%, which means if it's stretching just a little bit, it's going to break. So it's only if it maintained itself all the way through that it would stay in perfect condition. But if I change this to stretch to 20, in other words, think of this as a tension point. So again, we're looking really close. If one of these were to pull away from it, once it gets to about 20% more range than the rest of the scale range is, it's going to snap and break the relationship. So by doing that now, we've set it to 20%. That's a lot stronger than 5%. So there are ones that don't hit the ground and really break the binding. So we still have some that are actually maintaining. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. We've got some different controls in here. I'm going to get into some of these later, but turn on show binding again. And again, we can see that these guys are now losing that relationship as they go through. So, like I said, max binds, that has a huge effect. So if I were to lower this, you're going to notice that even the ones that were on top that were fine are no longer fine. If I set that to 50, you'll notice that these will start to bind together again. And then obviously higher as well, we're going to get more, more of it sticking together. So a couple of things I'm just going to quickly talk about is we select our tyFLOW node and we go down to particle bind solver. We can increase the sampling to 10. And that means, of course, it's going to slow down a little bit, but you'll notice that the relationship, there's less of these popping because it's giving it more samples to work with. Okay, so if you want a more of a stable sim, that's one of the key things to do. There's still this jittering, and we'll address that next, but just keep that in mind. Now, OpenCL, again, if we're if we support it with our graphic drivers for our video card, then having GPU acceleration is going to be a huge advantage. So strict determination is a useful one, which will slow down your sim, but if you were to be rendering from multiple machines, this will ensure that the sim's a lot more accurate. So some of this stuff for now, if you wanted to, you could turn off the force integration, as well as the partitioning here, and it's going to give you a different result, but it's going to be a lot faster. So if you're really looking for speed, these are two that you can disable. It's definitely going to help. Beyond that, if you wanted to sample the interpretation of the mass differently, so let's just go back to this for a second. You can kind of override or change the interpretation of the mass, so we can make this like really heavy if we wanted to. So again, it's based on the multiplier, so it's not really to make it heavier, but to make it lighter. So in other words, you can make this quite heavy through a couple of different ways. You can do your mass here, and again, you can make it relative to the binding, and you can make this much heavier. But then if you wanted to tie it back, you can there as an override. So you got a few different options. I'm not going to mess with mass this time around. I want to keep this relatively straightforward, but mass plays a big role with this sort of thing. Interpolation is just going to give it a slight more stability. So that's the main thing. I just want to, again, just mention this stuff so you know your options. Mainly, if you're getting a lot of jittering, I'm not worried about right now because we're doing it's a very low res sim, so there's just not much information for it to work with. When there's more resolution, there's more information for the relationship. But it's important to know this stuff. It's important to get your samples up. All right, now from here, we've got something that's pretty basic, but it's working. What if we wanted to make it break into shapes? So what we can do is we can do a cluster. And a cluster allows us to, you see these points that are being created. This is to allow, because it's on Voronoi cells, these cell points to create cuts throughout everything to generate different values, I guess, for the relationship between the particles. So if we turn on visualize, it's going to help us see colors to determine this. So just for the sake of visualizing this a little bit better, I'm going to put this to 0.8. I'll just turn physics and binding off just so it's a little bit quicker. Now with the cluster, we can see different colors representing the relationship. So it's mostly showing that they're in different groups based on this. That way, when they break apart, it's going to be based on these shapes. So we could either give it more shapes, right? And again, as we saw before, fuzzing, in other words, is just that randomization. So I think this is important. If you don't want to have like very fine cuts, we can kind of randomize that a little bit. So I personally think having the fuzzing, I'm just going to call it fuzzy, but having that randomization is kind of useful. So again, a lot of this is more controlling, like that's the boundaries and this is the actual shape. So in other words, if we were to make this shape smaller, you'll see the points go in more. So it's important if like you're getting something like this where you're like, like for some reason it isn't distributing the way I want. It's probably because the shape is too small and you might want to scale it out. So just keep that in mind. And again, you got the scale multiplier, which just makes it obviously a lot easier. Now, based on that, you can see how it's breaking up. You've got different options, okay? So you could also use object pivots and actually go and manually create nodes where you want all the cuts to happen. And that might be useful if you were to say, have this on the ground and specifically want certain areas to break it apart. So, you know, in this case, that's not really too important. The other thing is the cluster type is really the distribution type. So you have Voronoi cells, but then you also have turbulent noise. And I don't really mess with this too much, but this would be a way that you might be able to get some interesting shapes. Again, this is how it's grouping it together. You might need to play with the settings. Again, I don't mess with this one at all, but you know, I could see there being some potential. Okay, there we go. I was going to say maybe it needs to be smaller. So, you know, in general, if you wanted to get some, you know, different types of breakage, you could do it that way. And then and this is a different clustering method based on the neighboring particles. Again, not something that I really have messed with. I've been using Voronoi, just, you know, trying to make it as organic as I can. But, you know, this is just a way that if you wanted to get very specific kind of clogs of everything, then, you know, it could work pretty well. But yeah, so for now, I'm just going to go back to Voronoi. I think this will work well for what we're doing. The thing is, right now, what does it mean? Like it's colored it all in, but we can actually get this now to break apart based on these shapes. So I'm going to go back, change my voxels again, just for quicker simulation, because I'm going to turn on the particle bindings. Now, with cluster, what we can do is we can actually tag this. So we're going to set the channel to 1, and this means that we can then, you know, set up different and more complex relationships where we need to. But all I want to do is use this channel, and I'm going to particle bind, and we can go all the way down, enable clustering, and set that to 1 as well. And what that means is it's going to try to maintain a relationship between these individual groups. I'm going to keep the colors on just for a moment so we can hopefully see this a bit better. So we might see this now that as this breaks apart, it's kind of breaking into those groups that we set up. So again, I'm going to go back to Voronoi cluster, turn off these displays because they're a little distracting. But now we can see that we're getting kind of clogs of the shape happening. And to re-emphasize this, going back to particle binding, let's set the distance relationship a little bit higher. And what that will do is it'll mean that all of the particles are reaching out to each other in a wider radius. If you picture all of these particles kind of holding hands, it means that more of them are holding hands. So they're all kind of sticking together. So this way we're getting more of a defined bunch of shapes because of that. So again, I want to really re-emphasize, like, what these do and how to control everything, because it'll be really important down the line to understand that. Because let's say that everything's perfect, but you want a few bits to break off a little bit more than they are, or you want everything to be more defined, you need to have these controls. So the other thing we can do is turn on the binding ID here as well, to kind of further that relationship. So again, stiffness you're going to see throughout this, and that's just going to help it create more consistency. So lowering this should cause it to break up a little bit more because it's losing that consistency. So definitely getting a bit of that jittering. Again, we'll worry about that later. I'm not concerned about it right now. But overall, as we can see, we're getting a lot of this sticking together. Now, at this point, I want to actually start to move forward into finalizing this a bit more. So main thing would be that I don't want a binding of 3. I just want it to be enough that we're seeing individual shapes, but I don't mind having more stuff breaking apart. The other thing is that even though we are using the scale to communicate all the relationships, there still will be a little bit of inconsistency as we add more resolution. So in other words, as I put this down lower, it will start to change the result slightly, and we might need to compensate to, or overcompensate to maintain the look that we're going for. So just keep that in mind, that like as I lower this down, we might notice we're not getting as many chunks. And because of that, then we need to, either adjust the distance back up the bind relationship count a little bit more, or the stretching, whatever we want to do. But just keep that in mind that as we do this, it's not going to be perfect. We will need to kind of overcompensate a little bit, and that's just the nature of the game. But as we can see here, now we're going to getting more individual pieces as this collapses down. Okay, so like I said, I wanted to really try to emphasize a lot of that. Moving forward, I'm going to set this to just a little bit lower res, let's say 1.5. With my clusters, I just want to finalize this a little bit. So I might bring this down to 1. I'm going to set the scale, multiply to 40, and I'll remove the variation altogether. And I think that's going to just give us a nice kind of shape to start with. The next thing I want to do, we can see that it breaks up kind of nicely, so we can see all the individual chunks. So the next thing I want to do is just under particle physics. Let's see, I just want to lower the stiffness a little bit. I'm also going to turn process only this event off. And that means that as we build out a more complicated system, the information is going to get shared per event, or I should say calculated between events. So this is important to have on in general, just to kind of keep everything optimized. But if you're going to use multiple events, which we will end up doing, it's important to have that ticked off. Okay, so just going back to cluster, I'm just going to turn the visualize off now, but everything's looking cool. We got something that's still maintaining its body as it falls down. Obviously, as we get further into this, we'll break it apart more. Other things are, I'm going to set my stretch to 15, and we can bring the relationship up a little bit, but we'll lower the amount of relationships it has. And I think it's the main thing. There's not really too much more I want to do. I just think it's really critical that lowering the stretch overall is just going to help, and also let's give that some variation as well. So now we're getting this to break apart, but it's still kind of sticking together a little bit. and that's fine. With the collision, I'm going to I'd say set this to bounce less. And we can set this to be a little bit divergent, and that means that when it hits the ground, it might bounce randomly in a different direction a little bit, and that's just going to help it spread out a little bit more. Friction will lower, and it's just going to allow it to slide out more. Technically, we just say front faces, and that's going to be the normal. It could be faster. I mean, in general, it probably wouldn't be very noticeable, but already this is just going to giving us, again, something a little bit different. But now it's all collapsing down. At this point, I'm just going to increase gravity slightly. We're going to make it negative 0.2. And that's just going to help it hit the ground a bit more and break apart. So again, I'm trying to maintain that relationship as much as I can because we're going to start to really break it apart now. So we're trying to overcompensate a bit more than we typically would. But just if you're curious, like right now, the way it falls apart, it sticks together a lot more than we probably want. But there's a reason for that. If we want this to fall apart, I just need to go back to particle physics and where are we? Stiffness. I'll set that to 1, and you can see that there'll be a major difference now. Basically, this will break apart a lot more. So just keep that in mind. Like if you need it to break apart, bring the stiffness up at this point, and that's going to help it just break apart a lot more. However, for now, I want to keep that lower. And again, we could compensate with a little bit more friction, but I'm going to keep that lower, and it just means that this will stick together more. Because what I want to do now is I want to actually like rip the crap out of this. I want to really explode it. So I'm going to hide that guy, and I'm going to bring in my original tower. Okay. And what I want to do is I'm going to create a sphere, and this sphere is going to be, it's going to blow up the whole thing. So I'm going to create a new system here, and let's just say at frame 5, we're going to create like 200 particles is fine. I'm going to create a speed, and I'm going to create a position object. And so the position object, I'm going to choose that sphere there, and let's just turn that off, and then speed. Yeah, so we got that going. With the speed, I'm going to set my magnitude to 10, and that way this is going to really explode. And with the position, I'm going to set it to pivot, I think, and that way it's going to come from the very center and explode out. Okay, so the idea here is that we have this exploding and like these particles shooting out. I actually want this to rip the castle apart. So right now it looks kind of ridiculous because the whole thing falls down. So instead, I'm going to take the gravity, I'm going to drag it out into this new event. Okay, so I just pull the gravity out, and now it sits there. And what I want to do next is I'm going to add in a point force. And this allows me to actually use particles as forces. It's really cool. I love this about tyFLOW. So with point force, you know, by default, is it? Yeah, it's going to work. So by default, this is already working, but it's kind of crazy. So a couple of things we can do is force strength. I'm going to set this to 0.25. I think that's all we probably need to do, but like that, you know, is now exploding the whole thing. So it's kind of crazy, but it gives us a kind of interesting result where now the whole thing's blowing up. And of course, you know, if we wanted to do anything else crazy with it, we could give this more of a random direction. Ignore source particles is important. I'm just pointing that out because otherwise they'll affect each other, and you can see they kind of go in random directions. So it's up to you, but I'll keep it off, but in general you want that to stay on so it ignores it. The duration is important too, because maybe you just want it to like hit it once really quick and then disappear. So, you know, you've got a lot of different options here. Same thing with the influence if you want to lower that. Again, I'm happy with the default settings. Like it's violent, it's cool. So I'm just going to keep it as is, but now we have this explosive thing that's ripping the whole thing apart. And the cool thing is that we can move this wherever we want, and it's going to rip it apart differently. Okay, so that way it's going to maintain the shape, but the top gets destroyed. Now, it does look a bit weird that it's in zero gravity. So this is where it's a little bit trickier. Like I like Houdini, I like TP, like thinking particles, for this reason that I can create different influences based on different conditions. And you can do a lot of that here with a bit more work. But the easiest thing to do is to actually set this up where if this explodes, we send it to a different group. So what I want to do is I'm going to do a property test. And this is going to be one of those operators that once you discover it, you're going to use it for everything. And with property tests, and again, I want to have that above the collision, and link it in here, and we can set up different conditions. Do we want velocity? What do we want? I want to have differential magnitude. So by doing that, we can just set it to a low value, but what happens is it now moves into a different group. And we got to change this to greater or equal to, and that way the magnitude is fine, but as this gets hit, it's going to move them into a new group. Now, you'll notice that these particles are falling through the floor. That's because there's no property set up here. So the next thing I want to do is I want to hold shift and drag this in to clone it. I'm going to select both of these holding control, right click and say make instances, and you can see that now it's italic, and that just signals that these are linked. And that way if I change the properties of one of these, it's going to affect both. So same thing, I want to get both of these guys, copy, paste, and then holding control, physics, right click, make instance, bind and bind, make instance. And that way they're all synced, and we have the collisions and the bindings now working and the physics working in both groups. And remember, it was important that we didn't have, where are you at? Process only this event. We instead have it working for both. Okay, so really important. Now, another thing for speed that we can set up is like, as this explodes, we got particles that are flying off the edges. We also have all these guys. I'm going to do a few things. Let's set up a delete operator, and we'll set it based on particle age. I'm going to set it to like 5 frames. And sorry, I'm getting used to different workflows. So I'm setting this to add frame 5 to 5. This turns on, and we have that. There's a few different ways to do it, but I'll stick with that. Okay, so next thing I want to do is I'm going to hold down shift and clone that delete, and then I'm going to change this to on event entry. So in other words, just whenever particles go in here, they die. And what I'll do is I want to say surface test, and again, let's just drag this down above collision, and I'm going to create a box. I'm going to right click, object properties, renderable off, display as box, and now we have the see-through box. I'm going to move this slightly down. So the whole idea is that this box, we can say, I'm going to pick the box, we can say that, and link it up, if it goes outside of this volume, not inside but outside, it's going to kill those particles. So now these particles, as they leave the volume, they all die. And the reason for that is just it's going to keep our sim fast, because that way it's not calculating all those free-falling particles. It keeps it contained inside of this cull box that we've created. Okay, so now we've got this exploding. Looks kind of cool. Finally, I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to duplicate the display. Right-click both. Make instances. And it's just going to make it a little bit easier to look at. But again, you know, we've got the control there if we ever want to see like which group they're in. We've got that control there. But that's pretty much it. Like, we've already got like a pretty cool system. And I'm going to take it a little bit further, but I just want to get something like that going. And like I said earlier, if we ever wanted to, we can go back here and we can control the stiffness, and that's going to make this react differently. I'm also going to turn off the this event. It's kind of annoying to see, but that way we just see this exploding. And again, like, we can control the whole relationship here. Like, if I want to set this to 1 and make this break apart more, there's other controls we can work with too, but it will just kind of give us a bit of a different result. And same thing with the binding as well. See, I don't mind that. I'm going to lower it to 0.1, and let's just vary this a little bit, and bring the relationship down slightly. So I'm just eyeballing this. You know, there's not like some perfect settings. I'm merely doing what I think will look cool. So this definitely feels like clods of stuff, but it doesn't like really keep much of that relationship at all in the end. So again, you know, it just depends on what we're going for. It also depends on where it's being hit. So in other words, I can move this down to the bottom and is probably going to maintain the top and fall into chunks. So it just really depends. Like, if I want this to stay as chunks, then I definitely do want to, you know, you don't have to mimic my settings. I'm doing this purely for demonstration, but this should hopefully keep some of these chunks more contained. So here we can see we got more of those defined chunks. So you can see that these are the kind of settings that really control and have a massive impact on that relationship. Again, there's still a couple there that are floating, and if that's the case, like, if, you know, because what's happening is these guys are being protected by all of this taking most of the brute force, so it would just be a matter of changing the threshold here down even lower if that's what we wanted. So you've got complete control, like, how you want to break this apart. You know, and again, there's more things we could do. Like, if you wanted to entirely activate this, we could have a radius, like a particle that just spreads out infinitely and activates everything. There's lots of different things you could do. You could have multiple particle systems, like little pops here and there. You know, you get really crazy with this stuff. So I'm just trying to keep it simple, but you could create some really cool effects that control everything. Okay, so icing on the cake would be that I want to set up some trails. And I just love making me some particles. So these will be underneath because they're going to spawn to a new event. So I'm going to hold Shift and clone the gravity. And the reason for that is that, you know, I might as well get similar settings. Because these are lower in mass, and again, I could, you know, base it on this, like all of this could be based on the scale or the mass. We could set it all up, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to half the gravity, so these are lower in mass, there's more air resistance or friction, so they'll tend to hang in the air a little bit more. So I'm going to just create this spawn, and what's going to happen is these are going to be particles that are spawned. I'm going to make these look a bit more sand colored. And I'm going to do it based on travel distance. And this will create a lot of particles, so just be aware. So I'm going to set my spawn a bit lower. Step size, I'm probably going to increase the amount of particles in a moment, but let's just set the inheritance and give it a little bit of divergence. So I'm just throwing some settings in to start with. But all I want to do is I just want to get a basic idea of like how to get particles to shoot out and kind of look interesting as if they're kind of smaller, lower mass particles. So another thing I want to do is I want to clone the floor. And I won't instance this in case I do want to change it, because the properties of this are going to be very different to these two systems. So another thing I'll do is I'm going to set up a shape, and we'll set this to like 3D cubes, because I prefer to see, like, I don't want to see dots, I want to see cubes. So we'll set the scale of these to be about 30. And under display, we'll change to sprite. Make the color a little bit brighter. Okay. So at least there's something. It just makes it a little bit more interesting to look at. So I copied surface test. I apologize. I meant to copy collision. So we want collision. Sorry about that. Okay, so you notice it's a little bit slower now because we did that. And with my collision though, you know what? I apologize. I'm just thinking about this now. I probably want the surface test as well, purely just to kill any particles that fell through the floor. Again, these are dumb particles. Then there's nothing fancy about them. You could do a physical-based sim around this, but there's no need. Like, these are just there to look really cool and add scale and definition to everything. But because of that, it is pretty common that they will fall through the floor. That's expected, okay? So, you know, there's ways to work around it, but it's just not important. This is purely about emitting lots and lots of particles. So, going back to the spawn, here's what I want to do. I want to initially set this up to be like 0.5. I think we'll inherit a little bit more. Lower the variation. You know, just the basics. There's nothing too crazy that I want to do. I just mainly want there to be lots of particles. So by lowering the step size, this is basically the distance. So instead let's say instead of every 10 feet, now it's every 5 feet it's going to emit a particle. You know, however you want to visualize that. But it means that now we're going to get more particles being emitted. The other thing I want to do is we're kind of getting to that point that I want to now emit more particles. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to set this to like 0.8. Getting a little bit crazy. So it definitely is going to slow things down. But as you can imagine, we're now getting lots of particles shooting out. We're getting, you know, the sim is kind of coming to an end. And I just want to like look at how this is going to look overall. One thing I definitely do want to do is just give some turbulence to these particles because they kind of look a little bit dull. So with the force, I'm just going to go in here. I'm going to set this to turb. I still prefer the turb over Perlin personally. And I usually just, these are my kind of generic go-to settings. I usually just start at 2 and something between 0.1 and 0.01 depending on the scale. And hopefully that gives us something a bit more interesting. So it's looking pretty cool. This stuff here is kind of raining down slow, and you can see it's emitting these traily particles. So that's one last thing that I will do is animate the spawn. So we'll start out, let's say around like 30, something like that. I'm gonna, let's see. I'll start around here, just setting a keyframe, and then select tyFLOW. I'm just going to delete that keyframe and just bring this up to like 2. In fact, I'm going to move that. So, you know, I'm doing this kind of quick, but don't worry about my settings. Like, what I'm doing, it doesn't matter. All I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say roughly around here, I want to animate it from like 0.5, which was what I had, to 2 or higher value, meaning it's not going to emit much anymore. So initially it emits a lot, and as it breaks apart, it emits less. It drives me nuts when I'm supervising and I see people just emit constant trails, like spaghetti fingers. It looks really odd. So I always tell everyone, like, you want it to make it initially feel like it's exploding with lots of stuff breaking off from like cutting through the air. It's losing a lot of its mass, you know, whether it's dirt, sand, whatever. So by the end of it, there shouldn't be much left, and it definitely shouldn't be emitting the same constant amount. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. By the way, I mentioned this earlier, but really important is, if you're enjoying this, the whole thing is that we're just going through a quick part of a shot. So if you wanted to do an entire visual effects shot, going through like a real feature film pipeline and taking it from start to finish, go to vfxcourse.com. So if you're interested in getting all 8 videos, which is about 18 hours of training, it takes the entire visual effects live action shot all the way from start to finish. We cover a lot of crazy stuff in here. So I just thought I'd mention that just because it's very in-depth, and just if you're liking this stuff and want to take it even further, I thought it was well while mentioning. And again, it's entirely free. There's no trick to it. It's just, again, this is just a snapshot of a little bit of time rather than going through a completed shot. And it's night and day different working on a real production shot rather than something like this. And I look at demo reels all day long, and when I see someone who's just got a little test like this rather than an entire shot taken to finish, for me it doesn't evoke confidence, because I need to know that they can take a shot to final in production. So again, if you want to go to vfxcourse.com, you'll be able to get the entire 8 video class there for free. Okay, so that being said, we're almost there. We've done a lot. This is looking pretty good. Now it's emitting less particles over time, which is cool. It's still a little bit crazy. So overall, I think this is cool. Going back in here, I'm just going to adjust the stiffness slightly, but you know, I kind of like it. It just depends. Like, do you want it chunky, or do you want it to be more individual particles? That's the main thing. And in terms of this whole thing blowing up, it really just depends on, you know, where we want it to explode, how crazy we want it to happen. You know, we've got total control over this, and we can do plenty of different variations of this. And the cool thing is it's ripping apart, and we get some really cool effects from it. So overall, you get the idea. There's plenty more we could do with it, but I've explained the controls enough that, like, depending on the style, like if you want it to be more chunky, you can do more chunks. If you want this to be more individual particles, you can do that as well. And just in general, I mean, I like this. I think it's turned out pretty cool. There is a little bit of sliding on the ground, and that's because of just in general, it's just because of the collision here. If we added more friction to the ground, that would fix it. So, you know, again, entirely up to you what you want to do with that. But yeah, I think there's like we could do 100 different takes of this, and it all comes down to where we want this sphere to be. And like I said, use your imagination. This is just a sphere with some particles shooting out of it. If you want, you could create so many different variations, like multiple explosions, pop, 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 whatever you wanted to do with it. You know, you could do some really cool stuff. But in general, I just wanted to get something happening that looks cool, that, you know, you can take further and do what you want with. So, a little bit of icing on the cake, and then I'm just going to wrap this up. But, you know, I hope you got a lot from this. I hope that it's going to spark some really cool ideas. And yeah, so I am going to end it here. I'm just going to move this around a little bit. Mainly I just made the particles a little bit bigger, and I added some rotation. And I think that's just important because it's like they're too big. But with the rotation, it will make it so they're not so flat. The beauty of this is that for the most part it is entirely procedural, so if you wanted to adjust something, you know, you're going to get slightly different results, but overall, you know, you can prototype something very quickly and then go back and add all the detail and run the sim. Okay, I hope you found this video valuable. Like I said, I would love to do more of these, so if you're interested, leave a comment and let me know. I've only got so much free time I can dedicate to these, so leave a comment and let me know if you want to see more. Just type yes in the comments. And if you do want to see more, then I'll try to put out more videos on this subject over the coming weeks. So leave a comment, even a simple yes is enough, and I'll try to build more training for you right away. Finally, I'll be putting out 1 to 2 videos every week around similar visual effects related subjects. So if you found this video valuable, take a moment to subscribe to my channel, and I'll do my best to always serve you with the best possible content and whatever I can to give back to you and the rest of the industry wherever I can. Thanks for watching, and make sure to check out some of the other tutorials in my channel, as I've got a lot of content and I'll be posting more regularly. Also, make sure to check out vfxcourse.com to get the 18-hour free visual effects training class while it's available. Go to vfxcourse.com right now. And like I said earlier, let me know if this is something that you want to see more of. Answer yes in the comments, and I'll do my best to make out more training on tyFLOW in the future. Thanks again for watching.